Somebody say something. Sorry, there's an echo.
There, go ahead, sorry.
Okay, perfect. Is it okay if I share some slides? Will that work with the tech?
Yes, yes, that should work.
Cool. All right, just give me 1 second. Okay, can folks see my screen?
We can't see your screen.
Great. And I can barely see you, so if there's any hiccups, just unmute and let me know, or else I may not notice. But yeah, as Joel said, my name is Tamara Layden. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm an ecology PhD student at Colorado State. And I'm also the Indigenous Research and Data Governance Coordinator with Mountain Sentinels, and also the Indigenous Land and Data Stewards Lab, also at Colorado State with Dr. Dominique David Chavez. And I really appreciated you, Joel, kind of setting the stage on what we're talking about today. And I also wanted to get oriented with some language. And I'm not sure what's been covered at JSET before, so I apologize if this is repetitive, but this is just helpful for me and kind of grounding in the space, using the same terminology, hopefully. So kind of unpacking a little bit of what Indigenous data sovereignty is versus Indigenous data governance. Indigenous data sovereignty refers to the fundamental and inherent right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern their own data, whereas Indigenous data governance refers to the mechanisms of enabling data sovereignty. So for me, as an outsider working in the community I was working with, which I'll share more about in a second, I am focusing on Indigenous data governance. And in order to support Indigenous data governance, we also need to be clear on what Indigenous data are, what does it include? And I think this focus on transdisciplinary work really highlights a lot of these features because it's information in any format that impacts Indigenous lives as individuals and also as collectives. So this includes aspects of land, so focus on Indigenous data resources, histories, hydrology, titles, that types of thing, and then data about Indigenous peoples as individuals, but also as collectives. And just kind of focusing on what Indigenous data could be across the landscape. We think about Indigenous data ecosystems applying to global landscapes because all lands are Indigenous lands, irrespective of colonial governments that may occupy them now. And these lands and relationships to place continue to be maintained through Indigenous knowledge systems that support healthy and vibrant ecosystems. And so you can think about Indigenous data governance as being really important to helping reaffirm these knowledge systems and interconnected place-based networks that we see across landscapes. And I also want to acknowledge too that while I'm stating that this is important and really key for this conversation and just justice in general, there's also a long history of ethical misconduct with regard to Indigenous data. So knowledge co-option, misrepresentation, exploitation, things like that. And so when I think about Indigenous data governance, I'm really thinking about how to counteract those different elements so that we can focus on Indigenous data sovereignty. And this is another kind of key piece that I don't know if it's been discussed yet in JSET, but it's important to bring up and always good to have reminders. But the care principles for Indigenous data governance is a central example of this movement towards Indigenous data governance and Indigenous data sovereignty. And it's meant to complement the FAIR principles, which we might be more familiar with. But just to touch on the care principles that requires researchers to work to ensure a collective benefit of Indigenous people so they have continual access of the data ecosystems and they apply to their work. And then also the authority to control so that Indigenous peoples can self-determine the use sharing, and accuracy of the data that apply to them, and also researchers' responsibility to have the data management systems be self-determined by the Indigenous peoples to which they apply. And then there's the ethics component of this, which kind of ties all this together, which is just that Indigenous rights and well-beings are centered throughout the research cycle. So inclusive of the data ecosystems, but also beyond that. All right, I'm at 5 minutes and I finally reached some of my research, but just bringing this framework into the context of Latin America in particular. I worked with the community of La Bendición from southwestern Guatemala, and they've been displaced from their homelands about 25 years ago. So they went from the highlands of Guatemala to the lowlands of Guatemala. So completely different habitat to them, and just a lot of disruption. So since then, they've been working to recover and strengthen livelihoods, local knowledge systems, and rights. But previous experience with researchers has really undermined these efforts and perpetuated this knowledge extraction that I mentioned earlier. So our goal together was to center Indigenous data governance principles and the shared generation of Indigenous ecosystem knowledge. And just focusing too on the topic of transdisciplinary research and topics, we covered a variety of different data together. So we collected social and ecological data, information about local plants and animals, also ancestral medicine knowledge, social knowledge of the community and the landscape context as well. So a lot of different items. And since I don't have time to cover all the things that we went through, I just wanted to summarize some of the challenges with working in this context and some of the opportunities this brought up for us, focusing on this Indigenous data governance framework. So one of the things is that, like I said, there's this normalization of an extractive research partnership, but this coupled with no national recognition of Indigenous sovereign rights was a challenge, but it gave us an opportunity to reaffirm Indigenous rights and elevate a global standard of ethics, despite it not being enforced by the government necessarily. And then the other aspect, as we might know in different contexts, communities have full and abundant lives. They may not be thinking about data ecosystems, but as a researcher, where this is my focus, I had the opportunity to work with them and have these discussions in a way that I could facilitate and help them think about these things when they wouldn't ordinarily have the bandwidth to participate in those discussions. Similarly, there is no data management or sharing protocol, which can be challenging with communities who do work with external researchers and maybe don't know where to start. So together we did co-draft a data management use and transfer agreement that we could use for our project, and also a template for future projects that they could use. And then there's also some concerns with language and just terminology with the legal framework, but also Spanish to English. I'm using terms from CSU that are in English, and also I would define as jargon for myself, not just academic, but legal. So translating that could be a challenge, but we really just tried to slow down and do it piecemeal throughout the project, so we were sure that we were clear on what was happening. And then lastly, kind of related to all these things, there's no digital infrastructure. So how do we hold Indigenous data that's digitized in a way that they can access it was a challenge, and it's something that we're still working through. I gave them a hard drive and we've been communicating about the data, but it's not a super easy thing for them to access themselves when they're still working on getting computers up. But that's just something that we can think through and build together as part of the project. Just to kind of close out on why I felt that this was really important and how it benefited the community. We had this knowledge generation as locally controlled and utilized to support their goals, their well-being goals, livelihoods, et cetera. And then decision making was for the collective. So this community is also thinking about their environment and what surrounds them, as well as their families and themselves. So these were all interdependent. And then we also centered Indigenous nation building through these efforts, rather than the North-led knowledge production. So me as an external researcher, and that data, but focusing more on their needs. I know I'm at time, but I just threw in some resources that I thought could be helpful for understanding care principles and also this kind of international context. But I will stop there and stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are we giving questions at the end? Okay, so it's Isaac turn, right? Isaac, are you ready? You can share your screen if you want.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll share my screen here in just a bit. First off, I just want to thank Tamara for kind of setting this up on the vibes. I really appreciate kind of the multi-scalar approach, thinking computationally, thinking ethically, centering Indigenous lands, and thinking, you know, really thinking critically about the various like ethical questions that arise from such a project. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, and I don't like to do that, but I think it's important to do so in the context of how we arrive to research, particularly with research on Indigenous lands. And one thing I want to share with you all to kind of begin is a quote by Max Le Brion, who wrote a wonderful book, Pollution is Colonialism, that I think has been really useful for me as a geographer in thinking about these questions of ethics of centering Indigenous lands. And so this panel and the various questions on open data and data sovereignty really hit at some foundational questions in my work. And I'll read this quote off on Max Le Brion. And he asks, how do our disciplines, pedagogical norms, and research methods benefit from access to Indigenous land, life, and knowledge? This is coming from a recent Nature paper. And I'm going to read another quote too that I think is important to kind of orient ourselves, and also orients, I think the gravity of what we're trying to get at, like with these type of questions. And this is coming from Candace Ushikani, who asks, how will the earth recognize us? So thinking about both of these two questions together as a geographer, I think is absolutely essential, especially given our moment right now where there is a mass rush to come to understand and do work with Indigenous peoples, Indigenous lands more broadly. So I'm going to share my screen to begin to explain some of these components a bit more deeply. You all see my screen?
Kind of, yeah. Thumbnails on the side, yeah.
Cool. As long as you see parts of it, I'm having trouble kind of zooming it out here. But yeah, so here's this slide. Hopefully, that's of me. So myself, I am a Chicano, born and raised in Denver, Colorado. I'm a descendant of the Huitepeque in Mexico. And I come to these questions of Indigenous resistance, through various discussions and histories of counter mapping. And so the various kind of three kind of fields that I work on to answer some of my questions here are coming from digital geographies, which I will explain here what that is. So by digital geographies, I'm referring to the culmination of debates in critical cartography, critical GIS, critical data studies, critical media studies, and increasingly indigenous data sovereignty, right? I really think it's really important to center indigenous sovereignty because some of those questions that are coming from indigenous sovereignty are radically changing how I think how folks engage in all questions of digitality, data, come to that work that I think are really important, and I'll talk about some of that. Then the second component of my research subfields, Latinx and indigenous geographies. What does it mean to begin to know the world from the perspective of indigenous geographies from Denver, from native Denver, from the homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and over 40 indigenous nations that call Denver home, right? Like what does it mean to begin there in terms of how we come to know, and then also economic geography, more broadly, the critique of political economy from conversations and racial capitalism, critical colonial studies. And so kind of the three big questions that I ask are: how do social movements produce space? How does the digital shape social spatial relations? And importantly, and I think what this panel, this discussion is trying to get at is how do indigenous peoples choose to share their stories to the settler world, right? So this is, I think, partly perhaps a distinction with some of Tamara's work. This is really getting at more questions of engagements on like the ethnographic, like really gauging at like how do indigenous peoples, right? Where's their autonomy in this, right? Because so much of how research is conducted, right, very often tends to forget about these very good questions. And so I'm going to share a little bit about my research within Denver that I did as a part of my dissertation, and a big component of my dissertation was responding to a few things. One was the various ways in which Colorado institutions of knowledge are literally implicated in the genocide of indigenous peoples. Denver University in particular, founder John Evans, as I'm sure many folks know here, was implicated in the Sand Creek Massacre, the 1864 Sand Creek Massacre. And so that's like one component of thinking critically about the various institutions, academic institutions that we live on, but also the knowledge component, right? The various knowledges that institutions of knowledge continue to animate and how they are oriented. And I'm thinking this through histories of cartography, critical cartography, and the various ways in which cartographic methods literally produced Colorado territory, settler territory into being. And so part of my dissertation was to archive kind of that genealogy, right? And so the other component of my dissertation was, okay, so despite acts of genocide, despite of the various ways in which knowledge continues to be oriented, as it is entangled always in racial capitalism and settler colonialism to erase indigenous presence, how can we insist on indigenous self-determined futures? How do we insist and make visible indigenous cartographies? And so one of the things that we did in response to these longer histories of genocide and also very recent social movement memory, such as the abolition of Columbus Day in Colorado. I'm not sure if folks know, but Columbus Day began in Colorado as a racist national holiday in 1907 that was then exported as a national holiday in 1937. That is like a racist genocidal holiday, right? And so Native peoples in Colorado for a long time organized to refuse that holiday, but it wasn't the holiday per se. It was the logic, right? The logic of dominion, the logic of possession, the logic of patriarchy, that continues on to this day, and that continues to be sustained by the various knowledge practices of science, settler science, and technology, right? And so the other component of this exhibit was to foreground a community archive, is to really insist on the various practices in which communities could form their own archive of history, of knowing Denver as a counter to the various histories and knowledge practices that erase their presence. And so one of the things that I think is important in the context of this panel and thinking about community archives and knowledge practice is the data component, right? The afterlife of the archive. Archives to me are counter maps in a sense, and in quite a literal form. And I think that's really important. The centering of indigenous refusal, the centering of indigenous mapping practices. I'm happy to talk about what sorts of mapping practices I'm talking about here. But some of this is very visual in terms of various art, various forms of art, of storytelling, but also oral. There's also the non-visual component to all of this. And so lastly, kind of thinking kind of big picture about this work, and like really thinking about geography on indigenous lands. I'm sorry that not everyone here is a geographer, but I think, if we could think about these institutions on indigenous lands, how do we center land back? How do we organize our knowledge practices for that fact? And so I love this quote by Robin Kelly, because so much, especially critical work can kind of just be on critiquing and chronicling kind of the various forms of violence that are very real, absolutely. But I think importantly for us, the transformational component. What does that mean for us as researchers? And Professor Robin Kelly states, without new visions, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down. We not only end up confused, querulous, and cynical, but we forget that making a revolution is not a series of clever maneuvers and tactics, but a process that can and must transform us. This is that transformational component as to how we arrive, right? More than our positionalities. Our positionalities are absolutely important, right? As to how we are at, as to how we come to the work. But it has to be a much more in some, learning from Max Librion's anti-colonial lab and thinking about the practice of mapping, the very practice of data practices. I believe transformational data practices, mapping practices require humility. Like, what if we centered the practice of humility in the work, accountability? I recently published a paper that might be interesting for some folks here, commentary and dialogues in human geography called Towards Accountable Digital Geographies, where I collectively kind of trace and invite collective inquiry, because the various issues that we are facing today require a collective response. It can't just be one person. It has to be a collective component, particularly as we are responding, right, in a moment of open fascism, white supremacy, that continues, that the digital world, the computational, the digital materialities continue to animate such violence, such epistemic violence from here, the various lands that we are in to Palestine, right? So I think we are in a very important moment here to discuss these questions of data sovereignty in very particular ways. Thinking about equity, how do we think about equity within these questions of data practices, and importantly, good land relations. And so by good land relations, I'm thinking about the materiality of data, thinking about the computational hardware, the amount of energy, space, water it takes to even sustain the various infrastructural computational approaches of the data. AI, for instance, demands a heck of a lot of energy, cloud storage. But there was a report that it takes more energy now just to store data more than the entire airline industry. And so with that, I'll share this sticker that I shared with folks at this exhibit launch, the Remapping Native Denver exhibit that we housed at the University of Denver a couple of years ago. I think this is what it's about. Some folks might have seen the native bumper stickers in Colorado. They're not native, most of them. It's this kind of weird folks from Colorado with new folks coming in. This is a reminder of the various homelands that we in. And I believe that our knowledge practices, data practices should be oriented towards land back to the Native nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. Thanks very much. We're gonna, just for the sake of time, we'll move on to Matt, and then we'll open it up for a conversation, but thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Isaac and Tamara, for setting the stage and starting a really interesting conversation. So yeah, my name's Matt Ross. I work primarily on what I think of as empowering open data science. And luckily, when I started here, I met Doreen Martinez, who started to teach me some of the, who I think's on the call somewhere, some of the complement to the FAIR data protocols. So my lab was deeply oriented around the FAIR data protocols, so findable, accessible, interoperable, reproducible. And that's sort of the core of our open science. But we also do think a lot about the care setting. And I'll just sort of talk a little bit about our lab. So I think that the name Radical Open Science is largely a joke that has now become a reality somehow. I was joking with the lab that there's two bad ways to name your lab. One is after yourself, like Ross, which is arrogant because like you're just like the Ross lab, you're all part of me, which feels arrogant and not great. The other way is to be like, we're the global hydrology lab, but then that's also arrogant because you're like, I own this academic intellectual space. So instead of just doing one of those terrible ways of naming your lab, we did both. So that's why we're the Radical Open Science Syndicate. That is the Ross lab. And the lab uses it more than I do because I always feel quite embarrassed to state that. Partly because I'm not sure that we're actually radical, but what we meant at the time by Radical Open Science is that when we're developing our open source protocols, we do that development in the open. So basically, if we're writing code on a project that's funded by NASA or whoever, that code is open from day one. So it's really against the scarcity mindset. It's meant to say, like, look, nothing we do is so special that people can't sort of benefit from using it, and they won't scoop us. Like, it's anti-scooping. Scooping's not a thing that we're focused on. But sometimes with these positions that I think we've inherently taken, there is a sense, I don't know the exact terminology I would use, but that we think things being open is the better. And only recently in the last couple of years, I've been into several conferences where indigenous data sovereignty has been brought up. And I've had a lot of really interesting conversations about what the lab does, and maybe I'll just set up some of what we do, and then we can have a broader discussion. So often what we're doing in the lab is working at the national scale, particularly in the United States, to take data sets that have been split apart. So there might be like 400 or 500 entities that collect water quality data, and those can include tribal entities. Because of federal regulations, those entities, whether that's the state government, tribal government, there's all kinds of entities that collect this data. They are as part of this protocol, they are meant to share that data to what's called the water quality exchange. So it goes into this big pool, but it's not made interoperable. Our lab spends a whole bunch of time taking all that data back out, and we when we take it back out, we try to make it more useful to more people. And so, for example, if you collected chlorophyll A data set to check on the number of algae in a stream in 1990, how do you know that that number that you got is still the same number that you would get if you went out in 2010 with totally different machinery, totally different technique, et cetera? And so that is what we're thinking when we're thinking of open data, open science, is taking data sets that have been published somewhere, but they're not doing the amount of work that they could be doing. And we go in and basically try to high grade them to make them as useful as possible for other people. Now, that is a good example of a data set where in my workflow, there's no intent about studying indigenous sovereign lands as part of that data generation. However, us cleaning and generating what we call a machine learning ready water data set would empower someone to then go use a satellite to build a machine learning algorithm with Landsat and produce estimates of water quality in any part of the country, including sovereign lands. So I've been working with Ed Hall on some water quality predictions in Lake Yohoa in Honduras. And that's an example where, like, if I weren't working with Ed, who's deeply embedded in the community in Honduras, I could be like producing this algorithm that predicts water quality in this lake that I have no relationship to at all. And I just want to study the impact. And so we do make these data sets that are machine learning ready, and therefore sort of we're pulling them out of their local geography on purpose because we're trying to make it so more people can use them. But that means that we're stripping away some of that local context. And I think that's where this like fair and care interact in a way that I still don't have a lot of like clarity on what's the best thing to do, where I think we're empowering better water resource decision-making, you know, or I hope that's what we're doing. But what we also could be doing is empowering people who have ill motives, and maybe they want to use remote sensing of water quality to go after some regulatory thing on a sovereign land from outside of that land. And so that's not something that I feel particularly adept at. At some of these conferences that I've been to, we're talking about indigenous data sovereignty. Some of the stuff we've discussed is intent, like I'm not making this data set to then extract specifically data from, you know, a tribal land. But if there was a case where that was a specific focus of interest and it was on tribal land, then that's where the care stuff you need, the care data approaches you need to re-engage with, as Tamara was pointing out, and engage with people on the who live in those lands. And so, yeah, I think that in this context, you know, there's this other side of openness where who are you empowering with your open data? And only recently has the lab really been thinking about that, in part because only recently we've been starting to produce pretty powerful estimates of regulated things like water quality from completely outside of the physical context of that space. So these tools are extremely powerful. And they're kind of like AI, as Isaac mentioned, where they feel a little bit magic, but the predictions they produce are actually quite reliable. And they're starting to be at national scale. So you don't have to go into any specific space, but you can use these tools and these open data sets to make predictions and estimates that could be used for good if you empower the right people, or they could be used for ill. And I would just say one of the like nitty gritty things that we have discussed a lot in the radical open science setting is we discuss all the time, what's it mean to be radical? Like this, I don't know, like now the name guides us more than any other intent. So we're like, how can we be more radical? What is radical? Why? And one of the things is that we actually changed our licensing from our code. When you go to any of our like well-supported code bases, if you go to it, the license that you'll see will be a very permissive MIT license. So an MIT license is like a Creative Commons license, meaning like if you go use our code, you can take it and do anything, including up to starting your own company and making millions of dollars off of our code. And that is in opposition to the more radical licensing, which is called a GNL licensing, which is viral. Does anybody know about these? They're so awesome. I really wish we used them, but we have a good reason for not to. Viral licensing means if you use our code, your code has to be open. You can't make money off of our code unless it's in the open. And so it infects all downstream users who would copy our code or our models or our data. But a goal of the lab is to empower those who are disempowered. And we thought the MIT license allowed someone to close off their code if they were using our data or code to do something, but they were not in a position of power like I am, security and almost tenureness, where I can sort of say and do lots of things and it doesn't detect my material existence. But let's say you're studying environmental justice in a political entity that you're going to feel attacked and you're going to use our tools. You might want to close that code for as long as possible to protect yourself because your identity is at risk. And so that's why we went with this much more permissive license where you could go close off your code because we felt like it protected those who are the less empowered, even though the more sort of, if you were being like hardcore tech, open, yeah, you would do the GNL viral license because everyone downstream would have to be open as well. And so that's where like that was inspired in part by long ago conversations with Doreen and others who have taught me about care, to think about more broadly. Like a lot of people ask me why we don't use the viral license, and that is why. So that's one example of where we're starting to think about this stuff. And then I would say the other part of this is like, I think there's a lot more work to be done about the kinds of open science our lab does, which is using, like satellite data is a good example. It's relatively unbiased. It's just a survey of the Earth at some known interval. And, but its use can be biased. And we have not gotten sophisticated at all. All we do is harmonize that data and make it easier for more people to use. That's all we think we're doing. But that can have downstream consequences that we're not anticipating. Whereas I think care has been most strongly implemented in places of data collection. We're not collecting data, we're aggregating it and harmonizing, so I think there's a lot more discussion on the collection side, but there's less. I don't see nearly as much in the literature about like, what do we do with satellite data? I know Ed's interested in writing a paper about what you do with satellite data, and that there's this much stronger potential for like the swooping in science, but you don't have to swoop in, you don't even have to go there. You can just from afar come to conclusions without any local engagement. So anyways, that's sort of the perspective I'm coming from, and I'm very like excited and to continue to learn and build our approaches around this stuff. I really like some of Isaac's values that he was thinking. One of the things that we hold dear in the lab is being vulnerable in the open science space. So we're very open to being wrong and changing our approach based on feedback from the community. That's all I have.
Let's give a big round of applause to all three folks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tamara, Isaac, and Matt for presenting some of the work you do and your approaches. And we had a big interest in having this conversation about precisely those tensions, because in the seminars that we have held so far, both data accessibility, especially in data scarce regions, and open access to data, but at the same time, sovereignty issues and ethical engagement with community issues have both emerged. And it seems to be questions that are rapidly changing, and we thought it would be good to kind of dive a little bit deeper, and you've given us a lot to think about. So thank you so much for participating. And yeah, I would like to open it to the floor, or maybe to the panelists first to engage with one another, or from people here or online to ask questions to all or some of the panelists. That's usually how we start, and we also have a few questions.
I guess I could start. I had a question, yeah, for the panelists. I've been thinking a lot about this this recent report that came out. so on open data, there was a report that came out. The biggest benefactor of open data has been the oil and gas industry. How do we contend with that? Like, how do we contend? You know, like these great platforms that I'm sure a lot of folks use, like Google Earth Engine, among others, and thinking about indigenous land at the same time. So it's just throwing it out there.
Isaac, what's the context around biggest, like what's the, biggest benefactor?
Yeah, like the oil and gas industry has access to all these, these data sets, these open data sets, and they are finding ways in. They're finding ways in, I think, both using the legal, there's like a legal, they're fudging the legal system, in a sense, by getting access to these various data sets. And we are seeing this rush of data at multiple scales, right? I don't think there's any like one issue, but I think right now there's one issue we could think about is the green rush, right? For lithium deposits. Of a big question that's going to be happening here in Colorado, for instance, with the rush to an urgent rush, a necessity to transition away from fossil fuels. But at the same time, it's still like the oil and gas industry kind of driving that and benefiting, profiteering from that.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. Tamara, you unmuted, go ahead.
I don't think I'm the best person to respond to it, maybe in the way Isaac is maybe getting at, but I just wanted to know, just in the field of conservation and ecology, which is where I'm in, the tensions between, capitalism and capitalist enterprises like oil and gas and the field itself are really strongly linked. So it's not, that stat to me was not surprising, right? I think it was a recent Source article that was like, Chevron donated X amount of funds for conservation. And I was like, great. So they're there, and that's kind of implicit. So in my mind, I'm like, how many of the folks in this field are like, we do want to move away from that, or we're trying to actually build this relationship? I'm not going to say which one is better or worse, but I don't think that there's a consensus on what to do with that, if it's inherently bad or good. That can be a different JSET panel situation. But I will say that working in the community I was working in, and I wasn't the first researcher there. And so I was asking, like, where is the data that happened before, that was collected here? And they're like, we have no idea. Someone came in, they did some research, they put it somewhere else, and it could be open data. I didn't find it, so probably not, but just the notion of open data benefiting question mark, right? Who has access? And I was just talking about the community I was working with, who they don't have computers yet. So when we talk about open data, that's my biggest struggle, is I'm like, the people who can access it are not the people who are actually stewarding the land right there that I can see. I want to hand them the data that I have in my hands and not put it in the cloud. For definitely like CSU and folks who have that infrastructure there, they can access it, and I know that. But I think that's where I get a little bit more reserved around open data for who and why. So just adding that layer in.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of discussion going on at the level of like OpenAI and all the bots and Claude and Gemini that really highlight the importance of licensing. So like, for example, you could have open data that's empowering the local community, but is explicitly not allowed to be in like a training set for these external, that's like the biggest example, because to them, open data is like literally everything ever on the internet. And I think that this gets at this point that open data almost certainly first benefits the people with sophisticated enough tools and resources enough to use that data. And who are the people with that? It's wealthy oil companies, and it's venture capital money, and it's the kinds of things that I think when we're working in our lab, this is why the GNL viral licensing is attractive, because if like GitHub, there are open science people who are suing OpenAI because they can prove that it took code from GNL licensed database repositories, and therefore OpenAI should be open too, because it should be infected by the license, but they're going to win a lot of these lawsuits with people like OpenAI. So anyways, I think that these are huge questions, and I think we have one project that's in conjunction with the EPA that's meant to improve access to water quality data for everyone, and they actually have they have a panel of more than 100 folks, and 25 of the people on the panel are tribal communities, and so that the tool development itself is from the ground up, including all of the stakeholders who are generating the data, including the tribes, and that's a case where like the outcome is constantly being vetted by those who are producing the data, and then ideally able to use it again for their own purposes. But again, yeah, I totally think that this open data, who benefits? I think the answer is always going to be the people who have the tools that are sophisticated enough to handle it right away. And that I don't know what to do with that, given that my lab is basically at least 40% funded to produce those data sets. Yes, that's obvious.
B has their hand raised.
Yeah, I'll just also chime in too about some of the work we're doing with the EPA. I'm B Steele, I work in Matt's lab, and this whole idea of like data access and not being able to find data that's even within these water quality portal, right? And the water quality exchange, it goes beyond even those with quote unquote sophisticated access. We have many folks who are within governmental organizations who cannot access their own data that they have put into the water quality portal, right? So it goes beyond just you know, like tribal nations and folks with sovereignty over their own data, which is really something that feels very troubling to me as someone who's in the data science field and in the limnology field. So but that's just a comment. Thank you so much for hosting this, y'all. This was a really lovely conversation to hear.
Just a question for the panelists. Again, gratitude to all for this conversation. I'm curious about whether those on the panel have intersected with the parallel narratives in the environmental justice literature and the narratives associated with the approaches around community-owned and managed research. There's a large history of COMR. It's just another way of doing research that's heightened awareness of the sovereignty of the information in the environmental justice space around community-owned and managed research. I'm just wondering if those on the panel have seen that literature and how there are similarities perhaps between that and indigenous data sovereignty and governance.
Yeah, I could get into this. Yeah, this is a great conversation, and riffing off some of the comments before. The open data benefits, yeah, it's just like this long history of the reproduction of the rule of experts, right? Still, to kind of riff off of Timothy Mitchell, and that's kind of been the case. And so, like, this question of community. Okay, so like, what are the community protocols? I think that's one of the duties, I think, of institutions of education, right? To elevate, to center, and advance those community capacities in the broadest sense. So one of the ways in which I am trying to attempting to get at this component is through my project, which I briefly touched upon. You know, that begins with an art exhibit, but then is now moving towards more of what I'm calling an insurgent data justice component, right? Thinking about the relationship or the transition from community archive, right, to data, its computational home, who has access to that data, and where does that live, and what are the various like community protocols that should and ought to be centered throughout the entire process, from its identification to storage and to these questions of who has access. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about, and also trying to advance at multiple scales within the institution. Like the question of community archive, well that's not just the project I'm engaging in, but there's a lot of like ongoing work across, you know, these institutions, CSU, I'm sure, CU, where students are engaging in community archival work, various histories. So this is like a nice kind of merger between the humanities in the broadest sense, and data science, more in particular. And so we could think about the various ways in which some of this is already kind of ongoing. It just kind of needs to be connected fully across institutions. We could think about various centers. For instance, at CU Boulder, there's a Native American CNICE center. There's the New Cause, the African American center, where these spaces, right, are thinking about these various questions, but who again gets that access? How do we begin to connect that? How do we begin to advance that? And lastly, I'll end on one of the things that will be attempting to engage in tracing all of these components is to invite community members and elders, in particular Native elders, to give voice as to how we could caretake, right, literally about these archives to data. I think that needs to be a central discussion going forward. Thank you for that question.
Just one really quick comment, just because I'm really excited about this panel and all the work that you all have shared and the ways in which you're thinking, and thank you so much. And I know we're close to time. So, but like the afterlives of open data, I think about like Isaac has done a lot of work on like digital enclosures, thinking about your comments, Matt, about like what happens with that data, Tamara's work and what she was sharing as well. I'm thinking about how governance actually takes place, like how are Indigenous communities and peoples actually governing their data, and like the polemic that Isaac opened with Max's writing from Pollution is Colonialism, as like science has often functioned on the unfettered access and assumption of access to Indigenous lands and knowledges. And so it just reminded me as well of projects and initiatives recently to circulate open data around Indigenous mapping to, on the one hand, render visible where traditional Indigenous territories and lands are and have been, but also some of the data sets that are being used to support that information are like highly inaccurate. So what are the implications of that? Like in Paraguay and South America, there are many different mappings and cartographic data sets that show where Indigenous lands are, but they're actually inaccurate. They're either too small, they're in the wrong place, they don't show ones that are in transition. And so like, on the one hand, some of the goals are to like support sovereignties, to support access and governance, but on the other hand, what happens with incomplete or inaccurate data? And these are like also large global data sets that circulate broadly, that are widely used, that showed up in some of the presentations today, that most people, you know, when you look at them normatively, it's really important. But on the other hand, like it just makes me think of like the connection between all three of your comments. Like what happens, like even if like the data might be going to Chevron or it might be going to like important like resistance initiatives, but nevertheless, like how do we reconcile with some of the ways in which the assumptions of the data and like the power and weight of the data itself? I don't know. Anyhow, I just think that it's a great conversation and really wonderful set of reflections that y'all have brought to the table today. I don't know, Andrea, you want to say anything too?
There's just so many things. No, thank you. Well, thank you all. It is 1:31, so if you need to leave, nobody will be offended. If you want to.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt. If you need to or want to stick around for a couple minutes. Yeah, these are hard questions. very quickly, it made me think of an experience I had supporting indigenous folks in Bolivia who wanted an archive of their history. So we found the funding, we put in the work, we compiled the archive, we made a paper version, a digital version, and an open online version, hoping that the first users would be them. You know, their organizations needed the information to sustain their demands, in this case, in front of the Natural Rights International Tribunal. But long story short, you know, we did, within our limited capacity knowledge, what we thought was right, you know, to compile this information and give it back. People who use it are mostly academics and activists, and it has proven useful, but they themselves don't have the space. There's a lot of turnover. There is the fact that it's on a hard drive and they don't have computers, and we are trying to figure out how to work through that and work on, you know, capacity sharing and all of that. But it's, I think it made me, yeah, all of this conversation made me think about these challenges of course, even how the best intentions can not necessarily sustain autonomy.
I think there's some fascinating things to be learned, and no expert at all, but definitely seen, you know, you have to be aware and a bit reflexive about unintended consequences, right? So I think in Ethiopia, we've done some work in community mapping of prosopis, which is a nuanced shrub that's detrimental to livestock and pastoral communities. And it's interesting what constitutes data in the word open data. And for them, they were sand-drawn drawings in the sand of where the shrub exists. And they, you know, for them, the word open constitutes the sharing of that drawing in sand with other tribal pastoral communities as they migrate, move, and evolve and shift, so that there's a raised awareness in the open amongst those colleagues and peers and fellow community resource shareholders, not open to the world in sense of like an open repository, right? That's machine discoverable, but open in the sense that there's a now mechanism on these WhatsApps to share that photo drawn in the sand with other communities, so there's awareness of where not to take their cows. You see what I'm saying? So I think we have to think critically about open science in and of itself can mean many things to many people and can be operationalized in different ways. And you know, inherently to them, that open data was useful in their context, given the governance they were comfortable with for the purposes and outcomes they were trying to achieve for the well-being of their societies, right? And so for them, they might see that as an asset mapping kind of asset. There's an information asset out there that's now being openly shared amongst those they trust and know socially. So anyway, would that be open data? I don't know, right? Depends on everybody's definition, right? And in an open data repository, maybe not, because you can't find it with a computer query. But in their context, it was very much open and very much beneficial. So.
That makes me think of Isaac's conversations of coming back to, we're both geographers, Isaac and I. And so, but like the question of scale and thinking about like open data and the scalar nature or the different natures of that scale and how, what it looks like. Because we can think about it as that massive like global data sets, or like you're talking about, like the much more kind of like, it's a smaller kind of circulation, but nevertheless, like still really significant.
Well, no, thank you very much, Tamara and Isaac and everyone for coming and for your thoughtful questions and engaging in this very important dialogue that is open, for lack of a better word, ongoing. Yeah, thank you very much, and we look forward to keeping the conversation going. A reminder that we have that event on Thursday at 2:30. If you
2 o'clock if you want coffee.
2 o'clock in the coffee and some conversation and informal networking opportunities with our visitors. we'll be talking about transdisciplinarity and ways to bring that to practice in the context of Latin America. Thank you so much. And
Thanks,
also
everybody.
we have these weekly seminars, so you're welcome to come every Monday, 12:30.
Thanks, everybody online. Appreciate it
Thank
as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for participating, sharing your work. Great to see you.